localization. I think yesterday you talked a little bit on localization and whether it's just paying lip service to localization or whether it's actually involving the community and doing it bottom up. And we have 4 presentations this panel. One, we're going to slightly alter the order. So we're going to start with G's presentation and followed by Amira's, then Zeena and Francine's, and then finally Tekleh's presentation. So G is a researcher and political educator, and he's involved with the Center of Lebanese Studies. He was a Gates Scholar here at Cambridge, and he's very much involved in the academic solidarity in action. And as you can see, he's going to be talking to us about localization or as repair. 15 minutes, G, please.
Thank you very much.
Otherwise, I'm going to have to use the Middle Eastern democracy. All right. Thank you very much.
That's scary.
I know.
Yeah, I do. I just came from there.
I know.
Thank you to the organizers, especially the team in CLS, not just for the conference, but for the past couple of years in delivering this bilateral chair program. They have been amazing in what they've achieved, which is to say nothing of the conditions that they are working in Beirut and across the region. I'm just going to start with a couple of caveats. The first is that my original presentation for the conference was supposed to be a political critique of liberalism. And in rewriting a presentation to talk about localization, I feel compelled to tell you that I am not a scholar of localization. So I'm instead going to reflect on kind of personal, professional entanglements over the past now 12 years with the field of humanitarian education aid, or what is referred to as education in emergencies. And I think I also want to say I wasn't here yesterday, so I missed the discussion that happened on localization, but my position is that this argument is well made and evidenced. I am of the persuasion that localization is a largely superficial complex concept, one that further embeds rather than transforms humanitarian systems. That being said, what I'm going to try to do is maybe make a proposal about how we can reinterpret the idea of localization as a reparative strategy. I'm hesitant to do so because I don't know how else we view the aid system than having reached a literal dead end, and we need to look no further than those who have been murdered point blank at distribution centers in Gaza. But I will try nonetheless. My main argument in drawing on reparative, decolonial, and abolitionist frameworks is that we can invert the gaze of localization, and in doing so, expand EIE's, or Education in Emergencies, EIE's scope of concern to include sites and institutions across the global north where Southern crises are often designed, directed, and reproduced. So before I do that, I'll just quickly situate the field of EIE. I know this probably happened a little bit yesterday, but as I said, it's the field of humanitarian education response, and it comprises a loose set of networks, organizations, donors, and discourses that really emerged in the 1990s at a time when Western humanitarian workers were trying to make why education was a life-saving service alongside things like food, shelter, and healthcare in times of crisis. And in recent years, including colleagues who are sitting beside me, there have been put forward really grounded critiques of this field that draw on decolonial frameworks and racial capital frameworks to talk about how education in emergencies is implicated in the reproduction of colonial histories and extraction and dispossession throughout the global South. I will offer my personal experience in the field as an example of these kind of racialized colonial dynamics. I worked as an expert education consultant in my 20s on the Syrian response to the war there. And by the time I was 25, I was earning upwards of $500 a day to provide expert technical advising to schools inside Syria that were staffed by Syrian teachers who sometimes had 3, 4, 5 decades of teaching experience, who were only earning $150 to $250 a month. At the time, I only had an undergraduate degree in music performance and not much else professional experience in teaching or formal education. So in other words, my primary qualifications for the job were those that related to my nationality, class status, and skin color. Okay, so over the past decade, localization has been put forward as one possible way to address some of the inequalities that I've touched on. So to shift power, resources, and decision-making to local communities, that's probably all clear. I think that it can be helpful to use this framework as a way to make sense of these proposals and their problems. This is the soft, radical, and beyond reforms-based framework from Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective. And I'll be paraphrasing my reading of how localization fits within it from Vanessa de Oliveira's book, Hospicing Modernity. So if we try to put localization, its debates, its proponents, its critics into this framework, we start with the soft reform space, which is the first column. The soft reform space rests on the idea that existing systems work well, but that minor tweaks or reforms are needed in order for them to work better. It situates institutions like formal education or humanitarian aid as fundamentally necessary and good, but only in need of better policies or more inclusive practices. The focus here is on improving access and participation, and difference is tolerated so long as that difference is disruptive. If we kind of locate localization as a soft reform, it involves cosmetic changes, especially those around participation, that don't fundamentally change the architecture of the aid system. This includes, for example, US aid's localization commitments, which involve directing 25% of its funding towards local organizations by 2025, which of course does nothing to redress the politically predicated nature of the agency's work. And this is obvious from Donald Trump's ability to all but implode it overnight on a political fascist whim. In the middle of the framework is the radical reform space. Radical reform involves the view that systemic change is needed to achieve justice and equity because injustice is built into how society is structured. Oppression is not just about access or participation, but about deep inequalities based on the uneven distribution of power, resources, and representation. This approach calls for major structural change by rebuilding institutions to include different voices, knowledges, life experiences. So localization as a radical reform encompasses a spectrum of approaches that I think range from the well-intentioned to the meaningful, or genuinely redistributive, but I think they share in a premise at some level that structural change can fix a broken system. So this might mean shifting real opportunities for decision-making to the quote-unquote ground, but it may also do so in a way that fetishizes the local as an unproblematic category. This can be done by ignoring the social inequalities that structure civil society across the global South, resulting in elite-to-elite class collaboration as the basis for supposedly devolved partnerships. By contrast, the third space, beyond reform space, recognizes that the system itself is the problem and that it cannot be fixed. Beyond reform argues that injustice isn't just how the system works, but that it's baked into the system's very foundation, rooted in colonialism, extraction, and domination. Trying to improve or reform it only keeps it alive. What is needed instead are fundamentally different ways of living, relating, and organizing ourselves outside of Western modernity. I think that beyond reform space is helpful for thinking with localization because Oliveira also offers sort of three practical strategies for beyond reform. And these are system walkout, hacking, and hospicing, each with their own possibilities and problems. So hacking as a counterpoint to localization involves redirecting resources from within existing systems to support alternative efforts or ends. Within education and emergencies, this might mean knowingly looking the other way while so-called implementing partners use donor funding for liberatory work that is actively at odds with the interests and agendas of Western donors. But of course, the risks here are evident. Hospicing, on the other hand, accepts the inevitable end of modernity's unethical and unsustainable institutions, while aiming to support a quote-unquote good death that allows for reflection and learning. It involves processing the system's successes and failures to guide the emergence of something new. This means confronting and releasing our own attachments to modernity. So it's a lot of information. This is my proposal. I find the framework helpful for at least two reasons. First, because Oliveira is clear that soft and radical forms are not necessarily bad. It's just that it's just important that we keep awareness of what we're doing in those spaces and why. And I think many people today have spoken about the very tricky kind of liminality that comes with doing necessary work, but also having to then negotiate necessary evils. So this is not a disciplinary framework. And second, I really like the idea of hospicing, or the idea of letting the humanitarian system die a good death, because it calls attention to the forms of care and consideration that are needed to dissolve the institution in the least harmful way possible, especially so that its death does not cause harm to those that are already most burdened by it. I suppose another way of thinking about that is an abolitionist commitment to aid is very different from Donald Trump imploding USAID overnight. Still, localization as a normative concept does not lend itself well to this beyond reform space, if only because it's a unidirectional strategy. This contrasts the multi-directional nature of almost all decolonial, abolitionist, and reparative frameworks that I've encountered. But of course, I'm going to suggest that it can be reparative nonetheless. And I think we can do that. We can potentially recover a reparative strategy of localization if we invert its gaze. So I'm thinking here of Arathi Sri Prakash's work on reparative alternatives to development. And here I'm quoting her when she writes, reparation requires us to reject assumptions that development is a necessary solution, and instead seek means of redress for the injustices which development has both failed to address and has actively created. This includes taking real stock in the fact that the development and humanitarian industries are implicated in an extractive and accumulative logic of a global periphery center dynamic. Just gonna have some water. I'm sure everyone's glad I'm talking about theory when we're supposed to be having lunch. I'm really sorry. I'm almost done. In EIE, taking these center-periphery dynamics seriously would require challenging the field's overwhelming geographic bias, which focuses almost exclusively on the global South. For example, only one in 10 articles published by the Journal of Education and Emergency examines quote-unquote crisis in Western countries, but in those contexts, the empirical concerns of this research are limited to refugee populations and the war on drugs. As feminist geographer Heather Turcotte notes, this racialized division between the West and the rest conceals the linked colonial geographies of crisis, which depend on actors' interests and organizations scattered across the North. Reinterpreting localization as a reparative project thus invites a fundamental shift, not in how or where aid is delivered, but in how and where our attention and action is directed. Rather than framing localization as a handover of a failing system to the South, this view asks us to expand our conception of the local to also include analysis and intervention at northern sites that reproduce aid-related harm. Doing so redirects responsibility and accountability towards these locations, like northern ministries, universities, NGOs, think tanks, financial institutions, where many humanitarian crises are reproduced ideologically, economically, and politically. Localization becomes not a strategy for inclusion or transfer, but rather a demand for redress at the root. So what would this look like in real terms? It might look like breaking with that geographic bias of our research worldview and beginning to populate education and emergencies journals with explanatory case studies of contexts like the US and the UK. Or it might involve doing public education and direct action work directed at ed tech companies or weapons manufacturers that are situated in the West and are directly complicit in the bombing of schools in places like Gaza. And if those suggestions sound nonsensical for the remit of a humanitarian field, then perhaps it is time for a common sense. Thank you.
So much.
Gee, I think you made yourself very popular by sparing 4 minutes. So you're 4 minutes closer to lunch. Right. Well, a lot of food for thought here in G's presentation on localization. It struck me when he was saying, should we let the humanitarian system die a good death? So let's keep that question alive. And we're going to move, we're going to have time in the end for Q&A. And we're going to move to Amira's presentation. Amira has flown all the way from the American University in Cairo, and she's kindly going to talk to us about weaponizing knowledge and the Sudanese education in the shadow of conflict and displacement. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you also for the invitation to be here, Maisa, and everyone who worked on this important meeting. You know, we don't usually have the luxury to sit back and think about knowledge and knowledge production, especially in a conflict and displacement context. So, and one of the reasons actually I missed yesterday, probably because, you know, we're going through a war in Sudan, so my passport needs longer time. But finally, I'm glad to be here. So basically, when I got the invitation for this conference, I was thinking what to share with you. My research, from migration and refugees, is my sociology and anthropology research. And then I decided probably maybe it would be a good idea to share with you our conversations as scholars in a conflict and the displacement context. So basically, I choose to, and you are familiar by now with this picture, right? Right? You saw it this morning in the first panel. Sahar actually had it on the screen. So this is the same university, the Gordon Memorial University, that's Khartoum University now. And even though it is liberated from colonialism, it's experiencing another form of colonialism, internal colonialism, if you like, this time. So basically, I wanted to speak about how knowledge is being weaponized, and then also some glimpses from how Sudanese education is taking place in the shadow of conflict and displacement. So I have so many things to share with you. We had so many meetings over the last 2 years since the eruption of the most recent war in Sudan in 15 April 2023. But I don't think I have the time to do that. So I'll try to talk about the most important things I would like to share with you. So, of course, as any conflict, the 15 April 2023 war has an impact on everything, all aspects of life, basic needs and rights, including education. And then also, I want to shed light on how education is taking place at the moment at the crossroads of conflict or fire even, and displacement. And also, you know, the hope, you know, the agency of, you know, people who are affected by this horrendous violence and instability that the war is creating. So what people are doing and how actually, as I can't remember who said this morning, our colleague who spoke about history not only as recounting of the past, but as learning from the past. So basically, we also, in our meetings and workshops, we try to reflect on the role of the academic institution, including universities, and also memorizing them as sites of civic struggle and solidarity. So please bear with me. The figures are really, really scary. Every time I look at them, I get really scared. So the impact of foreign school education, of course, I focus in this presentation on higher education, but I also talk about school. So the Sudan war produced almost 14 million people displaced, IDPs, in total, in addition to those who were already displaced before the war, half of whom are children school age. 2 million refugees in neighboring countries. I think now there are even 3. 5 million Sudanese children in conflict zones at risk of losing access to education. 19 million children out of school. 3 million children in primary school from 1st to 3rd grade suffer prolonged school dropouts. 1.1 million secondary school students face uncertain future due to their failure to sit for exams, especially in the areas that are controlled by the rapid support. So also when it comes to school, and this is actually one of the schools that was destroyed during the war, 10,400 schools have been trapped in war-affected areas. Most public education, and I think this is even underestimation. I take my figures from UNCR figures, from the data metrics, DTM, data tracking metrics. Most public education institutions in war zones are not ready to receive students, of course, because of the destruction. Majority of schools in safe areas have been turned into IDP camps, into shelters and IDP camps, and sometimes into military zones. Same story for higher education. 104 educational institutions, including public and private universities, research centers, were militarized, vandalized, destroyed, particularly in Khartoum state. And this figure is actually according to the Sudan Ministry of Higher Education and Scientific Research. The infrastructure of many universities, including laboratories, workshop, libraries, classrooms, and offices, were all damaged, burned, like this one photo here from Omdurman Ahliya University. This is from the library. One, I think probably number 2 important library in Sudan, Mohammed Omar Bashir Center. So it's completely destroyed, as you can see, burned and destroyed. In Al-Fashir, Niala, and Khartoum, and these are the hot war zones, all universities, public and private, are not functioning. Also, students suffer from prolonged disruption, risk of lost generation of students. At the moment, there are almost 500,000 students in 120 Sudanese universities. And basically, one of the meetings, actually, we were reflecting on the average time a Sudanese student spends in university, and especially those who are active and maybe not only in Sudan, maybe in other contexts, but at least I know many people who spend at least 10 years and 15 years only to graduate, either because of disruption, because of war or political unrest, or because they are targeted by the system, the regime in place. Again, more and more of the impact, this time on academic, on the scholars, of course, massive displacement, out migration. And this is actually adds to the already educational crisis in Sudan. At the moment after the war, it is estimated that 60 to 80% of staff members of all universities across the country left. They had to leave. At least 1 out of every 3 Sudanese graduate and PhD students out. This is even before the war. In 2016, for example, and that was before the war, 2,000 plus university staff left the country, including professors, associate professors, assistant professors, lecturers, and teaching assistants. There are also consequences, gender consequences and issues. Many, especially female professors, had to shift career, had to do something else because of either displacement or, and mainly displacement. So I think this is a bit of history about what's happening in Sudan. I always feel the responsibility that I need to probably explain a little bit what is happening in Sudan, because I know it's a mess, you know, not everyone really can get what is happening. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but you can ask me in the Q&A session that follows after. So I think it's easy to get where Sudan is located, but then not only geographically, Sudan is also a history of revolutions, of conflicts, and socio-political movements, 2 civil wars since independence, in 1956, war in the South that led to separation of the South. Power, versus religious and ethnicity, ideological, religious ideologies and ethnic ideologies have been always played as weapons to instigate wars and instabilities, war in Darfur, and then the rapid support forces. Maybe you hear about that in the news. That's not really fully covering what's happening in Sudan. And then the Hemeti, the leader of RSF, who was made by the previous regime, was called the Hemeti, my prediction, but now he's the one who is actually fighting the SAF, the Sudanese armed forces. So basically, the history of Sudan since independence speaks about 4 military coup, dictatorship, 53 out of 67 years, 3 wars, revolutions also, 3 revolutions, democracies, but endless cycle of military dictatorship, popular revolution, democracy, and now, of course, war. Maybe you have all heard also about the 2018 to 2019 Sudanese revolution that actually, in a way, led to the current war. So the war now is between Hemeti, the leader of RSF, and El Burhan, the leader of the Sudanese armed forces, who both are counted on the regime that was overthrown by the revolution in 2018. So, and after that, after the revolution, maybe you recall that we had a civilian government, but then they removed the civilian government and then they started to fight with each other, of course, over power. So this also gives you an idea about displacement and refugees, people who cross the borders. And as we all know, that people cross the borders in conflict situations, mainly to neighboring countries, right? Not to Europe, not to North America. So the crisis is there, actually. Not Europe migration crisis, okay? It's Africa migration crisis, the Middle East migration crisis. So as you can also guess, there are many Sudanese now in Chad, in Libya, in Egypt, suffering everything. And we don't talk about them enough, but they're really suffering not only racism, but everything. Like, they are denied access to education. They cannot get their residencies, that's temporary residency, for 6 months. If they leave, they cannot come back again. So it's like very, very messy, and it actually became even worse after Europe decided to impose its externalization policies on the countries of North Africa and the Middle East. So what is happening now in the education, I think just echoes what Marisa and our colleagues pointed in the previous session, that of course alternative education, remote education, online education is becoming somehow an alternative, but I can tell you that this actually worked in the first year. After the first year of war, I can see now that even students are reluctant to join this type of education. So basically, while I was listening to our colleagues in the previous session, I was also thinking about the sustainability of these, like solutions. Geographical relocation, universities relocated to safer regions inside Sudan, but also outside Sudan. In Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, and Uganda, and Rwanda. There are many challenges. I will point to it in the next slide. But also, I think what's the good thing that's happening now, that teachers and professors are trying to reorganize themselves. So they are benefiting from that marginal space that they had after the revolution, and they are now working to to reconstruct or reestablish the trade unions and professional associations that they lost during the military Islamic regime that was actually overthrown in 2019. So basically, and from here, universities, we had meetings in Cairo and in Nairobi, trying to recognize universities, Sudanese universities, as sites of civic engagement, of sites of solidarities. So before I talked about the civic engagement, I'm talking about here the challenges, higher education costs. I think we have already covered that. Digital learning and infrastructure. You cannot be in a refugee camp and speak about digital learning. And especially not all refugee camps are the same, of course. But there are some refugee camps, and especially IDP camps inside Sudan. I think this will be a huge challenge for them. There is also security and political restrictions because now the country, people are polarized. You're either with RSF or with SAF. And we are also punished based on loyalty to one of these two parties. But there are also chronic mental health and psychological struggles among students and teachers and professors because of the continuous war, displacement, and the uncertainty, especially displacement. You can find one person who had to be displaced 3-4 times because the war is expanding across the country. So are there attempts to rebuild? Yes, there are attempts to rebuild. So we met actually, as I mentioned, in Cairo, in Khartoum, speaking about higher education, speaking about tracing and preserving the history and memory of the role of Sudanese universities, especially after they got burned and damaged, right? So I think we agreed that Sudan universities are play a central institution in the country history and hopes for a future. Revolutionary politics, role of scholars and students historically in protests against government, including in the December revolution. So memory tracing, civic engagement, and solidarities are really recognized as important history to be preserved. Over time, civic struggles, significant, recurrent, resilient, but now face, of course, existential threats due to conflict and historical weakness. Recovery requires not just rebuilding infrastructure, but reimagining higher education as a driver of its equity and civic renewal. And in our conversation, many people started to question what is even the value of higher education. So we started to rethink, why we're having universities. Do we need universities in the first place? Because also universities were criticized as spaces of creating inequality and bias and gap between students, especially who are affiliated to, and Sahar spoke about that. As a Northern Sudanese, you can go to university, as South, at that time you cannot. So we also agreed that power through knowledge, ideas, and civic life versus power through implements of force and violence. And also, we agreed that we need critical reflection on the university as an elite, exclusive, and gendered space.
Oh, thank you so much. I know, you scared of me, no. Thank you so much, Amira. I mean, it's a fascinating, well, it's sad and fascinating at the same time to see the repercussions of the conflict in Sudan, but also very important to zoom in and see the role of Sudanese scholars during the conflict and how they're trying to sort of reinvent the higher education as a forum for civic struggle. Next, we've got a double bill. So we've got Zeena and Francine, and they are both. Are you gonna go co-present?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So they're again. The theme of the panel is about transformation, radical, and we're moving to transforming humanitarian partnerships. So dismantling the colonial legacies for refugee education, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. So we're so pleased to be here to speak to you today. about a book that the three of us, so Zeena and Ahmad and myself, we co-authored based on a study that we conducted together and completed a few years ago in 2022. And we've written about parts of this book in several publications, but we felt it was important to write it so that we could capture the whole project, which we think tells a compelling story that's quite relevant for our current moment. So the book's called Transforming Humanitarian Partnerships, Dismantling Colonial Legacies for Refugee Education, and will be published by Bristol University Press next year. So it's like a soft book launch. As you all know, the war in Syria was cataclysmic. It reshaped the architecture of global power and humanitarian response. The refugee displacement, coupled with the rise of right-wing nationalism, anti-migrant sentiment, and geopolitical interests that ensured the containment of refugee flows, became a driving force behind collaborative, partnership-based educational interventions in the Middle East. So our book focuses on this surge in partnerships in humanitarianism and specifically in the education sector within Lebanon. So our data collection took place between 2018 and 2021. And during this time, as most of you know, several crises across the world and within Lebanon occurred, including political and economic crises, disaster, and the COVID-19. And so the story is not only about refugee education, it's about education in a multi-crisis environment. Interest of time, conceptual approach, it's awesome, trust me. So we draw our insights from a vertical case study, which includes over 100 interviews with both global and local actors involved in partnerships in education and emergencies, 250 documents from international and regional education organizations, a social network analysis of 440 different organizations working within Lebanon and on Syrian refugee education, and 3 in-depth case studies drawn from a closer examination of 16 partnerships within Lebanon, including over 30 site visits and observations. So according to international organizations, to IO narratives, the shift towards partnership aims to foster improved coordination among organizations and is aligned with this growing emphasis on the localization agenda. Numerous global education organizations have endorsed the Grand Bargain, which I'm sure most of you know. It promotes this localization agenda, not as in the imperative sense, in the very dominant sense, the traditional sense of localization. Also, today, decision-making, funding, and implementation rarely rests with a single agency. Instead, humanitarian action increasingly resembles a complex network of global, national, and local actors working in partnership. So this narrative and environment in humanitarianism, so a localization agenda echoed in these big global mandates, and the engagement of a network of different types of actors is the global context to this book, and we critique the context in depth. We also contextualize the book in the hierarchical nature of the humanitarian industry. We draw from critiques that show the colonial legacies of the industry, including inequality in policymaking processes, paternalistic and deficit perceptions of affected communities, and the ways in which entrenched racism has led to particular dynamics and decisions in policies and aid systems. So one part of our study explores power hierarchies at the global level, and we look specifically at these big global partnerships like Education Cannot Wait, Global Partnership for Education, INEE, and others. And drawing on interviews with senior EIE policy actors, we analyzed how power structures are sustained and how issues of knowledge production and race underpin their persistence. The limited engagement of affected communities and local actors in global partnerships based on assumptions around capacity and knowledge have led to poorly contextualized interventions. And our findings also highlight the growing influence of market values such as efficiency and competition, and the expanding role of private sector actors within these big global EIE spaces. So through this analysis, we reveal how global education and emergencies partnerships, despite their collaborative rhetoric, often replicate the very inequalities they aim to overcome, challenging assumptions about what constitutes authentic partnership in the EIE context. So we mapped how various partnership arrangements emerged in response to the Syria crisis in education, bringing together the financial resources and the technical expertise of multilateral agencies, bilateral donors, society, private companies, philanthropic foundations, governments, and local organizations. These partnerships represent a transnational expansion of stakeholder engagement in refugee education and a dramatic shift in global humanitarian arrangements. So we conducted a network analysis and we documented partnerships among 440 organizations working on the Syrian refugee education response in Lebanon. This allowed us to geographically map the headquarters of these organizations and their ties, which means their relationships to one another. So if you see a line connecting these headquarters of organizations, that means they were partners in some respect. As you can see, partnerships in Lebanon extend largely from north to north, from North America to Europe, and then to the Middle East. And you can see obviously very few South-South partnerships. The network analysis also showed the prevalence and dominance of global organizations within Lebanon. So you can see in this visual, international actors, including IOs and bilaterals, foundations, companies headquartered in the global north, are represented by the dark dots. And those headquartered in Lebanon are the light dots. You can also see that the black dots are very densely concentrated at the center. So, and the centrality, based on network theory, it denotes influence. It denotes the strength of the ties. And so it can be translated as power. So our data show that power imbalances appear clear and long-standing in this space. Despite efforts within the education and humanitarian sectors to advance this localization agenda, our findings suggest that international actors retain the majority of decision-making power. Furthermore, organizations based in the global north have championed an effectiveness agenda rooted in market-based principles. The application of these principles has exacerbated existing inequalities, privileging international actors who set the performance expectations while placing the burden of compliance on local partners. So for example, actors in Lebanon who secured funding from international organizations describe their work as increasingly more output-driven, where quantitative data has to be delivered on a strict timeline in order to maintain funding. So this market-like output-driven environment hinders more personal and human approaches to EIE partnerships. I'm going to now pass it over to Zeena, who will discuss our findings from the Lebanon context.
Our interviews and observations with actors in Lebanon suggested two primary ways in which local organizations experience partnerships. And this schema sort of tries to capture that. The first is in terms of service provision, and the second in terms of co-construction. The majority of partnerships in our study exhibited the service provision model. This is a donor-implementer type of partnership. The donor either initiated the partnership or the partnership was formed in response to a call for proposals.
and the donor agenda drove the partnership. This often caused frustration for the service providers, particularly when it prevented organizations from working with populations that they usually worked with in the past, or redirected their work in other ways. And as one head of a local NGO noted, quote, "In the end, you're not equal. They plan and you execute," unquote. In contrast, what we refer to as co-construction partnerships, they were established with growth and mutual learning in mind and appeared to grow from local networks and the shared interest in addressing a locally identified challenge or gap. So to add nuance to our discussion, our book describes 3 partnership case studies in Lebanon that exhibit this co-construction, and for the most part, did not seem to fall prey to the types of power asymmetries we've described so far. These organizations prioritize participation from local and refugee communities, including teachers and families. Their partnerships exhibited overwhelmingly similar practices that we'll talk about briefly next, and they sustained their work through acute crises. So in each case, partners felt as though they were trusted collaborators on the projects and that international partners respected them. In turn, international partners voiced how much they learned from their local partners and that they trusted them to make decisions. As one partner described, "We communicate a lot, we reflect a lot, we discuss a lot of things because it's very, very important that the partnership has good communication." A Syrian teacher explained, "The partners don't patronize us by playing the teacher's role with us. On the contrary." Partnership linked to trust, communication, and care appeared to sustain education through acute crises. And according to partners, and as reflected in the words of a Syrian principal, whenever these factors coexist, you can just keep going. Our findings also brought to light the vital work of local actors in embracing refugee community knowledge and participation and valuing mutual learning through their partnerships. This mutual learning helped sustain education programs. It was especially clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, where our country-level data exposed the resilience and creativity of local stakeholders and refugees. And these are just screenshots from the lessons we observed via WhatsApp. They were held and created and held via WhatsApp by different organizations. And in the last image here, you can see students laughing at a voice comment made by the teacher. From our analysis of all the data from our study, we arrived at 5 guiding principles for partnerships in education and emergencies. And we must admit that we were surprised by the results of our coding. But here they are. These principles, shared repeatedly in interviews and documented through our observations, emerged as a counterpoint to unequal power in more traditional partnerships. Each of the 5 guiding principles demands a shift, which suggests the need for more overarching transformation in traditional ways of operating in the humanitarian sector. Although we acknowledge that deep structural change is needed to make permanent shifts, we posit that individuals and organizations can begin to spur such transformation by changing their own practices and organizations. And through these shifts, actors and organizations might also begin to reimagine and restructure the humanitarian arena itself. So when we started the study in 2018, the landscape of aid to education was different. The scale of the Syria crisis and efforts to contain refugee flows from reaching Europe led to this increased educational aid with a view to incentivize refugees to remain in the region. And the sector really expanded as a result into this network of partnerships dominated by international bodies and with increased private sector involvement. However, while the number of global education platforms and partnerships grew, so did the scale of the violence and the displacement worldwide, exposing the vulgarity of a system that funds the destruction of people, land, and life, and at the same time then bids for contracts to provide aid to survivors. By 2024, there were more than double the number of forcibly displaced people than 10 years prior, and the failure of localization has also become apparent. The sector's narrative of success has come under scrutiny, and the defunding of institutions signals a shifting geopolitical landscape. So against this backdrop, our study prompts a question about what lessons can be learned or drawn from the global educational response to the Syria crisis to inform the sector's future. Our research revealed that some of the most promising developments that sustained education and addressed power imbalances came from co-constructed partnerships among smaller, more independent organizations operating on the margins of the policy network. In contrast to major international actors, these organizations with close proximity to affected communities maintain control over their day-to-day operations. However, they rarely influenced the broader strategic direction or long-term vision of their work or of the sector, which remained under the purview of larger global entities. The COVID-19 pandemic briefly unsettled these established hierarchies and illuminated what transformation could look like, the community-based responses reclaiming agency. So what's needed now then perhaps is not more technical innovation, but a collective political realignment, and one that centers displaced people and host communities as decision makers. We found that even while displaced communities consistently demonstrate innovation and adaptation, their influence has diminished as the sector has professionalized, marketized, and expanded. Dismantling layers of humanitarian bureaucracy could allow for the return of more authentic, community-driven governance and problem solving. Our research also uncovered the transformative partnerships that were rooted in the knowledge and leadership of local and refugee-led organizations. These partnerships demonstrate that collaboration is a political process, one built on care, mutual respect, trust, and a shared commitment to each other. Where these principles were present, efforts could be sustained even in the most uncertain times. So perhaps to navigate ongoing uncertainty in the humanitarian sector and to imagine new futures, we must embrace grounded relational forms of partnership. We must resist the impulse to search for singular solutions or ideal endpoints. Instead, our study calls us to turn our attention to the processes of transformation, processes grounded in relationships. The shifts we advocate in this work towards care, trust, and respect, communication, mutual learning, and self-reflection are as much about rethinking how we relate to each other through partnerships as they are about how we work together to reimagine the architecture of the humanitarian system itself. Dismantling colonial legacies is a reorienting process that will require more than new tools or frameworks. It demands a collective political shift in how we relate, how we listen, and how we share power. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Zeena and Francine, for taking us from the journey of despite localization hierarchy persists to ending on a positive note of power shifts, of a political shift in power relations. So thank you so much. We have one more presentation by Tekle. And Tekle is a lecturer in environment and development at the Global Development Institute at Manchester. And he'll be kindly talking to us about the war in Tigray. So similar to Amira's presentation, trying to zoom into one of those examples to talk about scholarship in the shadow of atrocity, navigating responsibility, solidarity, and silence during the Tigray. And
I'm trying to rush.
may I convey the good news? Is
Lunch is here.
lunch here? Lunch is here, so we're
No
going to
pressure.
listen, no pressure, have Q&A and then have lunch. So we've got certain, no pressure.
Yes. Okay. So I'm not going to. I hope I will not last long in keeping that. How many of you know anything about Tigray? Anything? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Like Tigray as a concept, right?
As a concept, yeah.
Yes. So 10 people.
We can put it on the map.
And this is exactly how I feel every time I introduce myself and I say I'm Tekleh, I'm from Tigray. And like, what is that? And then I have to do the whole introduction of like, Tigray is this region where there was a war, where there is a war since 2020, and where there is this, where there is the worst human rights violation in terms of like number of people that were killed, the scale of things that were done in the last 3 decades, apparently. According to PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, which documents data on casualties of war, the graph of casualties of war kind of like peaked at the start of, during the period of the war in Tigray, like the global days from war, which is close to 1 million people were either directly killed or perished from consequences or indirect impacts of the war within a 2-year period between November 2020 and November 2022. But apparently, it doesn't make it to any of the international news outlets. And that if anyone has heard about Tigray, it's a fragment of information, whether Tigray as a region exists, as a concept exists, or there is this remote war that happened and something happened there. Like that, it doesn't go beyond that. And there is a reason for that. And I'm not going to go into the details of what led to the war and what the depth of it as we are waiting for lunch and we have somewhere to rush to. But I'm going to just tell you, Tigray is this region in the northern part of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is an old empire, and you should keep that in mind. And empires have a way of producing death and pain, and so that you should keep in mind. So it's at the northern end of the Ethiopian territory, bordering Eritrea, bordering Sudan, and the rest of the country. And I was based in Norway for the last 11 years. And at the time when the war started, I just had handed in my PhD dissertation, which focused on Kenya and Tanzania, something else. And I was just relieved that I was done with my PhD. And on the night of the 3rd of November to the 4th, which is the night of the American election, where Biden replaced Trump, on that night, the Prime Minister of the country appeared on national TV at 2 a.m. in the morning, in the night, to say that he has declared a war on Tigray, and alleging that the Tigrayan authorities, the original authorities, had attacked army bases in the region. And just after that moment, the whole region was put under full communication shutdown, which means you cannot know what's going on. So we know that there was a war declared by the Prime Minister, but it was impossible to know what happened and where the battlefields were, where civilians, what was happening to civilians. And it took a lot of digging, a lot of people smuggling themselves through borders, fleeing to neighboring countries to get the information that we needed from the ground. We have people that left the western side of Tigray into Sudan, which is unfortunate to hear that Sudan is in that kind of situation today, who would tell what they went through, where their relatives are in terms of what was going on. And 3 weeks later, on the 28th of November 2020, the Prime Minister appeared again on TV to say that he has won the war. He has managed to capture the capital city of Tigray, Mekelle, and his forces and allied forces, which are the National Army of Ethiopia and the National Army of Eritrea and ethnic militias from across the country, have managed to capture Mekelle. And then that was a victory. And in that speech, he says, this was done without any civilian, not a single civilian was killed in that process. And we had already, even within those three weeks, we had already started getting all kind of evidence of what was going on. And that is evidence of soldiers and militias going through villages, through towns, shelling the towns, killing the civilians on their way, burning farms, burning factories, and all kind of infrastructure on the way, and doing all kind of horrible stuff that I don't want to bore you with. But at the point of like my talk today is also sort of like draw attention to this crisis that happened, but the mechanisms that were put in place to prevent you from knowing about it, and sort of like to get people to see what could happen, what could go wrong when we don't pay attention to the absence of certain geographical region, a certain population when it disappears from media. And as I said, it was like we could see that there was we could see from the stories that people were telling that there was weaponization of rape. The ethnic Tigrayans were being targeted by militias allied to the army or allied to the Ethiopian government, and they were telling of rape like at a scale, and they were telling about the destruction of their villages and their towns. Just in the week leading up to the Prime Minister's declaration of a war, a victory, we found out, we had already the story leaked from people, but we found out that in the 24-hour when he declared a victory, the city of Aksum, which is the ancient capital of the Abyssinian kingdom, about 1,000 people were killed within a 24-hour window by Eritrean armies that are allied to. Just an example. But this is a city, and the cities were not that much affected compared to what was going on in the countryside. So it's just to show you the scale of it. And it took Amnesty International and international organizations to find out about this. About 2 months, like that February, this report came out in February. It took 2 months for them to find out what actually happened, because there was no videos or pictures of like what was going on. It took them 2 months to produce a report to say that something like that happened in the city, and they had to take that example because it was a stark example. But this was at a wider scale. And later, like Human Rights Watch, for example, kept publishing what was going on, like the like shelling of towns, like during that time. And it's it's a century's deadliest war. Apparently, you didn't hear about that. But it's about 1 million people that were killed. It was the kind of violence that women and girls went through in Tigray. It's, according to UN Commissioner, it's unprecedented. And she says it's in a press briefing after release of a report. She says it's unprecedented, and she says she's been investigator in many places. She's gone to Rwanda and many other conflicts, and this is as bad as it gets in terms of like the use of rape and sexual violence. And I said like the deliberate destruction of social and economic infrastructures, the bombing of like villages and towns, refugee camps and IDP camps was rampant throughout the war. And of course, it doesn't last there. Then you have siege. You have the destruction of everything. The MSF, Medicine for Some Frontiers, they went to Tigray a few weeks after the start of the war, and in that report they say almost 70% of the health facilities were like out of service, and they were either occupied by the army and militias, or they were basically destroyed. And it's just to show you the scale. And this was followed by a siege, like a 2-year-long siege, where the region was surrounded 360 degrees, where there was a single telephone line that works, where there was no communication with the world, like in terms of like internet, which means humanitarian agencies wouldn't even bring. Like the talk of localization of humanitarian agencies was, it's very important kind of discussion, but in this kind of context, it doesn't basically work. There is no, you cannot talk about localization when there is no access to people, which also calls on academics like us to sort of like draw attention to this kind of issues where humanitarian access doesn't exist, and you sort of like have to talk about something else. And then, of course, this was the Tigray region, which is territory of 6 to 7 million people, were besieged, which means no one was going in and out. There was no media. But the Tigrayans that were in the rest of the countries, academics, business people, like everyday people in the rest of the country were also interned. They were sent to camps that, as horrible as it gets, like 50 degrees Celsius, like into the remote parts of the country, and they were kept in camps. And we have evidence showing the kind of situations that they went through. A lot of people perished in those camps, or you just disappear, basically. Which means the war was invisible in all kind of ways. So the region was besieged, but the people outside the region were not also telling the story. They were not there to tell the stories to their neighbors, to the world. And I was talking to someone yesterday, like if you had gone to Addis in 2021 at the height of the war, you wouldn't know that there was a war in Ethiopia. You wouldn't know that a region of 7 million people was under siege. And you could have like UN agency meetings, you have international digital rights meetings, all that kind of meetings that happen in Addis. But a person that has gone to those wouldn't recognize that there was a crisis of this scale. And which is why I also like try to sort of emphasize this point. It is like an invisible human rights and humanitarian crisis. And you could see like this is a kind of like stories you would get on the BBC website if you go like rare stories from a hidden war. So like it's just fragments of stories that somehow people are smuggled out, or somehow a UN worker has gone and had to keep their name anonymous and to sort of leak information about what's going on. And the stories that came were horrible. And it has, I mean, a lot of agencies are now like international human rights organizations are calling it a genocide, and it's a genocide. We have intent, we have all kinds of the things that fulfill what's the genocide, but they describe it as a forgotten genocide, forgotten hidden war and all that. And I mean, forgotten from a perspective of certain audience, but not forgotten from people that knew what was going on in the place. So you have like these kind of stories that presenting the war as invisible, as forgotten, which is why I like recently I had to write a long journal about it. Like, why didn't my colleagues know about this? Like, why did academics that research and that do on topics similar to this not know about this? And so I had to explain. You could easily say like, it's racism. It's a remote, like geopolitically insignificant region in a country that is relatively significant in terms of geopolitical interest. But that doesn't, as a scholar, it doesn't make sense to just relegate it to the racism and geopolitical insignificance. So I had to look into the mechanisms that the Ethiopian government and its allies put in place to make it visible. So you have the context that they created. So through putting mechanisms like the shutdown of internet, the blockage of media access to the region, all kind of the surrounding up of the grass in the streets of the country as a way of creating a context of invisibility. But you also have the way the war was framed. Like the framing of the war also made it possible for a UK foreign minister to say, well, we don't want to be involved in this kind of situation. It's an internal law enforcement operation, and which wasn't the case. There is no law enforcement operation that costs 1 million people life. There's no law enforcement operation that should involve a siege that led to all kind of deaths that I mentioned. So you have, I think, the response to it, and partly because of what I was saying now, has been silence, but active denial, and then you also like all kind of complicity. And you see that it's not just from the political powers or others, but you also see it from the knowledge centers. Like, for example, I don't know how many of you know ACLED. ACLED is like, it's supposed to be a database for documenting atrocities and violence that is associated with armed conflict. But this institution was basically denying what was going on and saying that since we don't have all the evidence that we need, which is you cannot provide in that kind of situation, they say we cannot claim that something like this happened. And it wasn't just they were not trying to be neutral, but basically actually denying it. And you can see it from the way they were engaging. Like, there is no somebody, an academic would say, there is something has horrible that happened, and then they would go and say, like, we don't have credible evidence to support this kind of claim. And this is something that really horrified me as a researcher, as an academic, as a person that thought we had some kind of solidarity, some kind of cross-border kind of solidarity, which I really found upsetting. Then you see the UN system in itself, which I don't want to go into the details now, but there was an assessment that was done after the war by and so they would say that was a system failure. Basically, the system failed. When they had siege, when they knew that people were dying of like basic because of lack of insulin, lack of oxygen, they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything that is collaborative. That's something that could push the government to open the borders. And the Tigrayans were saying, where is humanity? Like, basically, where is humanity? What's happening to us? Like, why? And I think we were a little bit naive. Like, the Tigrayans were, to some extent, naive about the world, how complicit, how absent it could be in that kind of situation. And that was a constant question during the war. And as to academics, Tigray is home to 4 universities. One of them is Mekelle. Mekelle is like really active, highly connected university before the war, which has gone into like shambles. The 3 other universities were fully vandalized, bombed, and all. Mekelle is in the city of Mekelle, so it wasn't as affected by the vandalization and all. But you also have like direct bombing of the city, the university itself, by drones and all kind of weapons that the Ethiopian government used. And as this is, as I often claim, and it's often verifiable, it's a genocidal war, and the targeting of who was targeted in the war was also clearly elites, cultural and political and intellectual elites were the targets of the war. And in university, my own academic colleagues were subjected to killing, subjected to disappearance, forced to disappear, both within Tigray, but also beyond in the rest of the country. Which is which was also like a sort of like a rude awakening for me. Was like, you have Ethiopian studies is quite established, kind of like a network of researchers who study language, culture, history, and all that kind of stuff. You have African studies, we have development studies, my colleagues where I work now, who just went absent on this situation. And when you ask, well, like, why is no one doing anything? You get this like very common response, like, the Tigray situation is very complex. And so what is our role as academics if it's not to to analyze and to make the complex situations easier for the public and for the politicians, for others to understand what role is it that we want to play, that to make it legible for people. And that's precisely our role. And I think that's what I thought I was trying to play in the last 5 years, like to make the war legible, to make it easy for people to see what's going on. So connecting the dots, and by connecting the dots, you could see like a rare footage from the hidden war is here. Or you would hear about 50 people died in an IDP camp because of starvation. But there is no connection between this. So our role as academics is to sort of like connect the dots and show the broader context within which these events are happening, the kind of political context within which these crises are happening. And this is not a complex war. I mean, it's a complex war because you have weird things like Israel and Iran supplying the regime with drones, which is like these countries are now bombing their shit out, but they were supplying weapons to this same government, which is what sort of like makes it complex. But that's not complex. As an academic and human being, it's about what's happening to people that should matter, and that's what should be our emphasis as well. So I think I should short this.
Well, you cannot stand with this question and say,
so what happens is, like, you have the entire population under siege. You have there is no Tigrayan academic or humanitarian worker that could say anything if they are still on the streets in Addis or in the rest of the country. So what the responsibility lies on people like me that were luckily abroad. The responsibility lies on academics in the Ethiopian studies, African studies, or global studies scholars that should actually be bothered by the absence, should be bothered by the BBC article that says a rare story from a hidden war. So who should sort of like question? So what's happening in this place? What should we do about it? So that kind of, and I feel that was what was lacking here. I don't know if anyone in Cambridge has done anything. I don't know if there was any seminar or any blog about the situation, and that's, I think, something that we should look for absence. We should look for places that we don't hear about, but we know that something bad may be going on, and we should look for people from those places like myself to see if there is possibility to engage and to write and to sort of like so, and that's sort of like, I think we can't afford to not do that. So I was like, so crafting message, basically like writing to the ministers, writing to I haven't written to Cambridge, but writing to people who I think should have spoken, and I think somebody else earlier, and I keep forgetting about that, is saying like people in situations of crisis have within the 2 years I could see the change in the language between me and the difference in the language between me and my colleagues that were in Tigray. That I have developed the skill to sort of like communicate with the outside world, but a Tigrayan that was in Tigray would struggle to find the words. And often when you call on the phone, you would say, "How was it?" And then they would say, I don't have the words to tell you what I saw, what I experienced. And they are not just ducking a conversation here; they are telling you that they couldn't actually, whatever they say they can't grasp the scale of what they experienced. And it's up to academics like us to sort of like use existing established historical events like that and concepts to sort of like make the Tigrayan situation understandable for the public and for ourselves. And I think that's sort of like the thing that I've been trying to do in the last few years. Yeah, as I said, so we should sort of, yes. And if you want to read a little bit about me, you could find my, if you Google my name, you'll find some information.
Wow. Thank you. So much, Tigray, for educating all of us on Tigray. And I must confess, I was Googling and asking ChatGPT about the casualties, and none of them knew either. So, because they're obviously taking the evidence from the existing knowledge. And as you said, it's an invisible war. It's been silenced. Right. I'm going to ask a very biased question. Who would like to make themselves very unpopular and ask a question? No, let's maybe take one or two questions, to be fair to the panelists, to be honest. And then we'll all head and have a very well-deserved lunch. Please, Rabia.
Thank you very much for all of you. My question is about you talk about the network between the different actors and the humanitarian or Syrian refugees in Lebanon and beyond. And my question is, what's the role of the state in this situation? How this will be part of like the obstacle, how this can be part of this transformation? Because the relation is not just horizontal, there is also this relation with the state.
Thank you, Rabia. Maybe we'll take another question and then give time for the panelists. Only unpopular, I mean. Well, there is always room during lunch to ask all the panelists who are staying. Zeena, please. Go ahead. Oh, you've got a question. Oh, yes, please.
Question or a comment, sure, but just I was struck in the presentation, some of the parallels with Gaza, a more publicized in a way conflict, depending on where you live, but in terms of suppression, the complex narratives, and the complexity argument, and the silencing. I mean, perhaps we have a role, but very difficult role depending on where we're positioned in terms of silenced and face repercussions. So this zone of invisibility that you referenced really, the expression was very helpful. Thank you. I wonder if you might consider what is parallel and what is not in terms of visibility of these two things, and get the silencing similar. So there's something interesting there that might be explored further.
So visibility is not a guarantee, actually, that
the world will relax, and probably that's Zeena's point is, yeah.
Something interesting there to do.
I would, if I, am I
Yes,
supposed
please.
to? Yeah, so thank you so much. And yeah, it helps to get that feedback. But I totally agree with you. Like there's parallels with what's going on in Gaza and what happened.
Some.
I mean, there is a lot of parallels. There's a lot of parallels because it's basically a population is being targeted like by a state that has kind of created this narrative that demonizes the people that have been targeted. And in the difference I see, and I don't think in the bigger spectrum of things, it's that spectrum of events, it doesn't make the difference doesn't make sense, because the difference is the invisibility of Tigray as a, like that no one, there is no, you cannot Google and find as much information, image and stories as you would in Gaza. But as our colleague is saying, visibility doesn't, and I was trying to make that in the second point, like visibility doesn't guarantee that you have that. I mean, you may have a solidarity, public solidarity, but it doesn't necessarily lead to meaningful response from people who have people that hold the power of responding to that situation. And which is why I also was trying to point to the epistemic invisibility, like the making, like demonizing people and framing a war in a certain way as a war for the greater good, or
as a domestic problem.
Yeah, so that kind of framing makes even the things that we see invisible. Like you don't care about seeing children being butchered and starved to death if you think the cause is good and just and justifiable. I mean, there shouldn't be a justification for killing kids, but it can seem justifiable to a lot.
And you wonder how racialization plays a role in both in different ways. That I can't articulate in the moment.
Amir?
Yeah, it's related. I think it's quite related to what I have been talking about, and also the role of an academic. Do I have the luxury not to talk about Sudan at the moment? I have my research, I have other things to do, but not only that. I mean, I cannot resist to do the comparison. Of course, you cannot compare between one humanitarian crisis and another, but I see maybe it is not making a difference, but somehow I think it relieves a little bit, it makes my role or my obligation less, if you would like, because now I have to advocate. And we also, in a context like Egypt, you have actually to make up for the institutional, not only racism, yes, thank you very much for saying that, but also
I'm Egyptian.
Institutions are partially there. So the state doesn't do anything. I mean, it was like my research actually on integration. So when I talk about integration in Europe, for example, that, it's like the national model, but it doesn't exist in a country like Egypt to start to criticize it. And you have no rights as a migrant, or only few people who are recognized by UNHCR, they have minimal rights. So I have, I think this is a good space, to talk about that. But also not only the invisibility, but also I get, responses that's driven by feeling of guilt. Oh, we don't talk about Sudan. I was like, okay, talk about it. We don't talk enough about Sudan. We don't do something else. We talk only about Gaza. And I talk about Gaza, of course,
But for Egyptians, for example, they say to me, Sudan is very complex. We don't know what is going there, but we grew up talking about Gaza. We know what is going in Gaza. This is our issue. This is our cause, which is our issue and our cause and everything. But I don't know how to put it. I don't have the right words to say that, but I can see that racial element very clearly, honestly. So because, when the Gaza war happened, people were opening their houses. This never happened to Sudanese. I can only generalize, of course. I'm just trying to see, and I don't think it's I don't know how to say it. In a context of political repression and oppression, people have very, very small room to speak. Even about Gaza, by the way, they feel it, but they know that the minute they go out in the street and protest, they will go to jail. And the Americans who got deported to Denmark, the authorities get really mad if someone tries to go against, the rules, whatever the cause is, by the way. So I think I'm also tired.
No,
I wanted to share that.
No, but
Yeah.
there are a lot of parallels
we-
here
we
about the
bring a lot of
framing,
things,
about the
You
racism.
have to provide housing for people. You have to find doctors for them. You have to find jobs. We cannot talk now as migration scholars about what is happening in Sudan or in Gaza. I talk here in Cambridge. I go back to Egypt and of course we have our, spaces, but these spaces are not public or not visible.
Well, maybe then we need G's concept of localization as a repair, and we need to be more radical in getting those voices out. I mean, it's too institutionalized, the silence.
Humanitarian crises in the world.
Yeah.
You know what? In Tigray, actually, I was writing about that at some point, and also I got really shocked by my Ethiopian friends who became nationalists overnight.
Yeah.
And they're like, we have to destroy that region because it's. I was like, okay.
I don't want to end on that note.
Yeah, something positive.
Yes, I think, first of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists for amazing, outstanding contributions. I think that they really helped to bring in hope and light to a lot of, from partnerships to the Tigray war, to asking about how these scholars, Sudanese scholars are mobilizing, to these conceptualization of localization and how we could radically change it. So please, thank you very much and a very well-deserved. Please.